Good afternoon, everyone. Casey Thornbrugh here, USET and Northeast CASC Tribal Climate Science Liaison. Welcome to this workshop. I'm just going to give a few seconds for people to join. We're getting everyone coming in now. Awesome. Okay. Well, again, thank you and welcome to our workshop, Working in an Indigenous Space, Integrating Biophysical Science with Social and Cultural Concerns. As I said, my name is Casey Thornbrugh. I'm a citizen of the Mashu Wampanoag tribe. I thank everyone for working with me. Those of us on the East Coast are feeling a lovely early season nor'easter. Nice 90-mile-per-hour winds and whatnot, and so grateful to still have a Verizon, so I'm able to call in. Myself and my colleague, Dr. Darren Ranco, are going to be facilitating this workshop. And so the purpose of this workshop is to demonstrate through stories and discussion the value of integrating science into the relevant cultural context. And what we hope for you all as participants to gain from this is examples of how integrating that which you study and what you work on into, or I should say, let me back up, in acknowledging and kind of embedding that in the foundation of the cultural context for which you're working. And we had a excellent time over the past couple of months thinking about this. Myself, I'll give you a little bit of background on me. I'm a geographer by training. When I studied geography through graduate school, I focused on climate. And one of the fortunate things for me in geography was that it was a academic discipline where I could look at a so-called physical science, like atmospheric science, meteorology, and climatology, and connect that with culture and social science. And geography is one of the more flexible disciplines of study in doing that. But context, I found, is very important. I'll just say real briefly before turning it over to my colleague. One of my first experiences was through teaching. So when I was in graduate school, I did research, but then I kind of wanted to step away from research a little bit and do teaching. So I had the opportunity to teach at a tribal college at Donna Otham Community College in Southern Arizona. I was living out there and doing graduate school at the University of Arizona at the time. And in teaching at tribal colleges, Donna Otham Nation, it gave me a really good experience and understanding of like needing to teach science in ways founded in the culture of the nation and community. One of the things I really remember is the concept of high context teaching and high context learning, basically trying to teach in a way that is relevant to the lives of your students. And that was a challenge in the beginning because I was using kind of a standardized college textbook that a lot of the weather and climate examples are kind of like, Middle America, 4 seasons, a very different world than that of Southern Arizona, Sonoran Desert, and the real world cultural experiences of Donna Otham Nation for which I was teaching. So I had to really rethink and connect with elders, cultural instructors, language instructors, to try to understand the context to be able to teach in a different way. So I'm going to stop there and just I was sharing my story a little bit, but I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Darren Ranco, because storytelling is one important way to do this. So Darren, do you want to talk a little bit more about this session?
Great. Yes, of course, Casey, thank you so much. Darren Ranco here, Penobscot Nation citizen, chair of Native American programs at the University of Maine. You know, we have, as always, Casey and I have worked together before. We have the loftiest of goals. We want storytelling. We want you all to have personal reflection time and share back, and take a deep dive on the complications between Indigenous values of place, language, two-eyed seeing, and Indigenous science, and how all these things come together. So probably we'll be able to do that with plenty of time left over. I'm joking. The notion of storytelling as a way of knowing is so critical to us as Indigenous people. It is, I think, universally for human beings, ways of making sense of the world. There is no more important place to understand this value of storytelling than in our language. So we have someone who will be who's a language speaker and keeper who will share his perspective. But for us, you know, story and language are ways to communicate values of place that we all have as human beings. And you know, here we mobilize in our work the notion of two-eyed seeing, which is, you know, an approach brought to us by Elder Albert Marshall, who's a Mi'kmaq elder and language keeper and scientist. And for him, it's about what is, you know, the best forms of knowledge are the two-eyed seeing. For him, the Indigenous and the Western science way coming together create a focus. You know, I think bringing together storytelling and language to communicate and understand not only Indigenous people, but the possibilities for partnership around different kinds of knowledge is critical to how we do science in relation to the climate crisis. So for me, that is about right relationships, bringing together different protocols and ways of understanding, and really valuing them. Of course, there are power differences and there are sort of legacies of that, which make this even more complicated work because the integration can be very, very difficult. That said, we have people who will be able to speak to its possibility, but also, you know, within the value of story and place, you know, how does it, you know, if you actually are taking Indigenous knowledge and responsibility seriously, that might just change the way you do science. It might just say, you know, as opposed to dividing up a plot of grass one way, you might divide it up in another way. Really taking that value of place and Indigenous perspective seriously with two-eyed seeing approaches can really transform our roles and our understanding of our own values as it relates to place, whether you're Indigenous or not. So I think that's, to me, the lead in, the run in to where I think we're going to have some really great discussions and have a lot of discussion and time for you to reflect on how to do this work. So I'm super excited, and I think we will start. We're trying to do this in 3 different sections. We have a cast of great people, 5 presenters over three sections, and then we'll pause for some time for also small group reflection. And so I'll introduce the first group. Is folks from the done work on the tribal adaptation menu. We have Rob Kroll from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, Sara Smith from the College of the Menominee Nation, and Stephen Hendler from the U.S. Forest Service, who will spend some time talking about the work they were able to do to create a really compelling document and guidance that brings together different knowledge systems to communicate a path through for tribal climate adaptation. So I'll hand it over. I don't know who's going first, Rob or Sara. I don't know.
Yango Darren, and Yongo Casey. Segu Swawegu, Sarah Smith Yungiats, Onyoteaga na Iyo, Kale Wagwaho na Wagadaluda. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Smith, and I am a citizen of the United Nation of Wisconsin, part of the Wolf Clan, and I work as the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the College of Menominee Nation and the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I'll hand it to Stephen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Handler. I work for the U.S. Forest Service, the Northern Research Station in Houghton, Michigan. I'm also part of a group called NIACS, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And I will pass it to Rob.
Ujuniji Bimarazig, Robin Dijinakas, going in the Damascene, Philadelphia and Dunjaba, Anishinaabe Waking Endad, Glyphwick and Denoki. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rob Kroll. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. If you've not heard of us, we are an intertribal natural resource agency. We serve 11 Ojibwe federally recognized tribes in the Great Lakes region. All of our tribes signed treaties with the US government in the mid 1800s, which they ceded a vast amount of territory to the United States. They now live in reservations in their original homelands, but they all reserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather in their ceded lands. And we help them to continue to do that to this day, practice their treaty rights, manage the ecosystems upon which they rely for that treaty harvest. And a big piece of that is climate change. One of the things I get asked often is why, as a non-tribal member, I introduce myself in Ojibwe. Part of our mission at Glyphwick is to integrate Ojibwe culture into everything that we do. We recognize that language is kind of the foundation of culture. And I'm not an Ojibwe Moan speaker by any means. I know how to introduce myself. I know the names of a lot of animals and plants. I know some not suitable for work terms, but I'm learning, and I'm learning every day. And one of the reasons I do it is because of respect. I work for the Ojibwe people, and introducing myself in that language reminds me of who I work for and why I'm here, and that it's not about me, it's about everybody that I work for and work with. So we're going to talk to you today kind of about the history and the story of the Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu. And the first piece of that is actually the title that we were given in Ojibwe, because in Ojibwe Moan, there are really no words for climate change or adaptation or climate adaptation menu. So the team, and it was a team effort, went to an Ojibwe elder and we asked, what should we call this work? And he spent a lot of time with it and gave us the title, Debugin Jigadeg Anishinaabe Ejitwad, which literal translation means doing a thing the Anishinaabe way. But as with translations between Indigenous languages and English, there is always things that are lost in translation. There are always deeper meanings. Anishinaabe, one of the uses of that term is to refer to all of the original people of this land. So another way to interpret the title of the adaptation menu is going back and picking up those pieces and doing things the original way, the old way. And that includes the revitalization of language and culture as a climate adaptation strategy. And with that, I'll pass it to Sara, and she can talk a little bit more about the story of the town.
Thanks, Rob. So I'll start with the beginning, kind of this idea of where the tribal adaptation menu came from. So back in 2017, there we go. Some of our TAM team members participated in a workshop that was put on by NIACS, the organization that Stephen works for. And they have these menus. So They worked on the forest and watershed menu. And when you go to these workshops, you bring a project with you. And so the project was in regards to Menominee, or also known as wild rice. And so to keep the story really short, so we can talk about other things too, there was this need for Indigenous perspectives in these menus. Because during the workshop, the menu worked really well, but there were still some things missing. And adaptation in general, and a lot of the other NIAX menus are really reflective of the Western science and more resource-centric perspective. And so there was this need to create a menu that was reflective of Indigenous knowledge and perspectives. And instead of resource-centric, having it kin-centric. So as all of our relations. And so a very diverse group of us got together, collaborators from primarily the Midwest region, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And we developed this tribal adaptation menu. It was over the process of 2 years. So we deliberately took our time to make sure everything was done in a good way. We didn't rush through things. If there was something we didn't agree upon, we would talk about it. And it was to make sure that we all had a consensus, and we all, at the very end, were very happy with what we put together. And so that's a very brief introduction to our story. Our menu is really unique as well, because it starts with these guiding principles to help bridge relationships with those working with tribal entities and Indigenous communities, to understand some of the Indigenous perspectives, how to go about respectfully in a good way. And the menu itself is meant to be used across numerous different types of ecosystems and scales and management levels. And it can be adaptable for any Indigenous community as well. So with that said, I will then pass it to Stephen.
Thanks, Sara. Thanks, Rob. So we wanted to share a little bit about how focusing on language in particular, and including kind of ideas of culture alongside ecosystem management has influenced this work of the tribal adaptation menu. And so we wanted to highlight a couple examples that really illustrate that. And Rob mentioned one right out of the gate, which is the title of the document. And that that theme that Rob picked up on there also connects to the example that I wanted to share with you. So I put a link to the tribal adaptation menu in the chat in case this is not something you all are familiar with before. You have a chance to download it there and see for yourself. But these climate adaptation menus, sorry, I'm hearing folks are having a hard time hearing me. So these climate adaptation menus are essentially collections of plausible adaptation actions that you could take for a given situation. And normally, our adaptation menus, like Sara mentioned, they're very manager focused. And so we often start with a collection of ideas like how would a natural resource manager maintain the fundamental ecological functions of a forest or of a wetland? And it's this idea that a manager is pulling the levers to help keep an ecosystem, functioning the way it should. And through conversations with this tribal adaptation author team, we kind of turned that idea on its head and exposed some of the holes in that idea. And in particular, it kind of separated people from the natural world. And so the group thought about that and ended up articulating a new idea that now is included along with those fundamental ecological functions. And so we included a new climate adaptation action that is maintain and revitalize cultural approaches to harvesting and caretaking. And that was an eye-opener for us, but it really expresses this idea that Indigenous relationships with the world, and in many cases, harvesting and a reciprocal relationship of harvesting and giving back to an ecosystem, that's just as fundamental to the health and well-being of an ecosystem as hydrology or soils or some of these other purely ecological terms we think of. So that's an example of the kind of ways that we tried to always put forward Indigenous relationships, human involvement with these ecosystems as a way to help keep them healthy and adapt to change. Sorry about my mic. I hope that came through okay.
Another example of where language came into play, and also kind of the consensus building approach that the team took, and really taking our time and thinking about how to do this work in a really good way that reflects both sensible adaptation strategies, but also a cultural context that's appropriate. In this case, in Ojibwe and Menominee communities, but really adaptable to any tribal community by the inclusion of their culture and their language and their history. One of the topics that engendered the most discussion was invasive species. And we've had some talks about invasive species throughout the symposium. And for a number of the tribal members who were part of our team, even the term invasive species was problematic. And it's problematic because it has some really negative connotations. Some of the actions that we prescribe for dealing with invasive species promote some really violent imagery. And frankly, the term invasive species doesn't translate into Ojibwe-Moan, and it's considered disrespectful. So again, the team went to actually the same elder who helped us with the title. And he gave us the term Bakan Ngojiga Andadak, which translates to non-local beings. And the way he explained it was that these beings that we're thinking about originated somewhere else. They were often brought here by humans, but they are still operating based on the original instructions that they were given by the creator. They've just been taken out of their community and brought into a place where they're not maybe being held in check by the other members of their community. So the menu recognizes that non-local beings may have a detrimental effect to the ecosystem. There may need to be actions taken to help control that effect. But those actions go beyond simply chemical treatment or hand pulling. And we think about things like creating a relationship with those beings, respectful harvest. If you do need to engage in a stronger management action, actually having a ceremony and explaining to them and to the other beings around them what's happening and why these actions are being taken.
1 minute remaining.
Thank you, Marissa. And that really falls to the whole idea of all of the beings in the natural world being relatives of us humans. The Ojibwe term is Ndinwe Magridog, which means all of my relatives. We've had that to explain to us that it means all of the animate beings that ever have been, are now, or ever will be, are all related to us as humans. And we were put on the earth last. We rely on them for everything. They don't really need us at all, but what we need to do, because they care for us, is we need to care for them, and we need to do it in the right way. With that, I'll say Chimigwich Mew, open it back up to my teammates to see if they have any last words.
I'm Squash Wayog. You know,
Dwayne.
Yes.
Thanks for coming on today. Just want to give you some space. Dwayne Toma is a Passamaquoddy language keeper. He'll talk also about language and the stories we tell about place. Honestly, Dwayne embodies so many of the values of a traditional teacher. He is by far one of the most generous and genuine people I know. Thank you for coming on, Dwayne, and sharing your story. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
You really win. My name is Dwayne Toma from the Passamaquoddy Nation. It's an honor for me to be with you and to share knowledge and our connection to our mother. And I want to say that because that is what we've been taught. It's a connection to our mother. Let's put that into its context. Our mother, she's the one who provides for us. She nurtures us. She takes care of us. It's built in our language. Gichigigwasan. Gichi is our great. Gigwasan is our mother, the earth. I just want to share a little story about Abajiewe Ogitak Nigoman and the return of our lands. Gwezwimanik, which is Pine Island. Gwezwimanik, Muinwimanik, Kjimanzagam, Gepjijuwug, Wudagwakig, Zubeg, Guspem. All these words are very archaic. It's all built in the language. Gwezwimanik is Pine Island. Muinwimanik would be Bear Island. Kjimanzagam, Big Lake. Wudagwakig, Grand Lake. Because of the return of our lands, we're able to go there to have land-based education and spiritual connection that we've always had for thousands of years. Medicine gathering, ceremonies, connecting with all the elements and all our ancestors, because these are our relatives. They're our relatives. We have a deep connection and a relationship to the land and everything in the land. They're our family. So I think it's so important for us to be able to share the language components, because that is how we see things. The worldview through our language. It's all based in our language. So I'm just really glad that I'm able to have this opportunity to be able to share some of the language components. And also, it's real important, the ceremonies that we do in connection to our mother. So I really appreciate this opportunity to be able to share our story about Gwezwimanik, the return of our lands. And this particular island was returned back to our people in the 1800s when Maine and this Massachusetts made that transaction there. And this particular island was federally protected land. And it was Gwezwimanik to our people, but it was turned over, and it was they changed the name to White's Island. And over time, we're able to return our lands back to our people just recently. And we were just able to recently fly over our lands and sing ancestral songs in celebration and honoring of our ancestors. The return back of our relatives, back to the Passamaquoddy Nation and the Wabanaki people, so that we can gather and hunt and to be able to show respect for our territories like we always have done for thousands of years. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be able to share the return of our lands and how sacred our lands are to our people. Gee, will he win?
Thank you so much, Dwayne. And I'm going to post the really wonderful video. It's 20 minutes long, done by Sunlight Media Collective, that documents your flight over the land. And it's so touching. You know, to get something returned, to honor it, to sing for it. Just that meaning when you value place so intimately as a relation, just it's so powerful. So please, everyone, check out the video. It's really phenomenal. The next speaker, and again, I'm so delighted to introduce, is Suzanne Greenlaw, who is a PhD student in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Maine. She is a citizen of the Holden Band of Maliseets, and she's also my advisee. So I don't know, in order of importance, it's any number of things. And Suzanne will talk about, I think, really focusing on one project, but you know, to embody Indigenous values of place into research, something that the first group talked about, it can be really challenging. And I think Suzanne's story really helps us understand some of those challenges and some of the blind spots that exist within Western science systems that have don't always take Indigenous values of place seriously. So I'll just hand it over to you, Suzanne.
Great, thank you. I'm going to work at the storytelling component of this time. I'm not the best storyteller, so this is a good practice for me. I find it really interesting, the sort of position I'm in now as as a scientist, and how do people relate to me. I was recently spending time with a conservationist, and she referenced my study, the study that I work on with the sweetgrass. And she said, your study where you prove that Indigenous knowledge is correct. And I found that kind of an odd way of saying it. I don't agree with her. I didn't say anything at the time. I just let her say it. But I don't really agree that I proved Indigenous knowledge is correct. I think that practice, I think Native people have their own way of knowing and being, and I don't think science or study proves or disproves it. What I really see, sort of my role is more making space in the biophysical sciences for Indigenous knowledge to be wholly represented, right? And where Native people still remain with the knowledge, right? Oftentimes, scientists like to take out parts of the knowledge that they find useful for their study and leave the rest. And when I read those studies, I'm concerned by the end result, that they're actually not using a functional form of knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, for their outcomes. Recently, well, actually in 2018, David Chavez and Gavin published a research article titled "A Global Assessment of Indigenous Community Engagement in Climate Change Research," or climate research, where they assess the different levels of Indigenous participation in climate change research. And they found that 87% of climate change studies still practice an extractive model with Native people. The outside researchers use Indigenous knowledge with minimal participation or decision-making authority from the communities who hold the knowledge themselves. And then a few studies reported any outputs that directly serve Indigenous communities. If we're here to serve, well, if we're here to even conduct good science, regardless of what community we're saying we serve, I think it's really important that people understand how to represent Indigenous knowledge in science. And so the study that I'm going to talk about, the Sweetgrass Study, highlights some sort of the friction and the different approaches in addressing a research question and their outcomes. So I work to help restore sweetgrass harvesting in Acadia National Park. And I'm a part of a study that the initial research question was to, like, how does sweetgrass respond to Wabanaki sweetgrass harvesting? I wasn't on the study yet. I came on a year later after this. And the initial research design was set up by sort of a botanist who had very little previous history working with Native people and in science. And so he did a very sound, scientifically sound study in methods where he looked at literature to inform his methods. He developed a very systematic approach to see how sweetgrass responds with transects and being repetitive, and it can be publishable. And then when it came to having Native people come in to pick sweetgrass, Wabanaki people come in to pick sweetgrass, this is where I started working on the project. And very quickly, I saw problems with it. Also a co-collaborator and I saw problems with the research design where, yes, that one, thank you so much. I love that paper, in part because it actually, so Marissa Weiss just put the link to the paper. It just puts numbers to something we already feel, right? It puts a publication, something I can reference to something that we already have and feel. So please look up that paper. But so very quickly, I saw the problems with the research. In part, I mean, both as a Native person and as a scientist. As a Native person, it was really disrespectful. It broke a lot of cultural protocols to tell a harvester where to go. So harvesters would come in, and they already had predetermined locations, predetermined areas to harvest, regardless of their opinions. It was, you harvest here, and they would often say, I don't want to pick there. But I would say, well, I'm really sorry. This is how the study is set up. This is how this is going to work. Can you pick here, please? And they would do it, but it just felt really disrespectful. And then and also we weren't really capturing what Native people wanted to pick, right? So there's a lot of reasons why that study was set up in the way it was, but it wasn't actually supporting, showing Indigenous knowledge at all, I think, in its whole. A scientist chose location, a scientist who had zero knowledge of the grass itself, the use of it, chose everything, right? And just brought Native people in at the end to pick. So within like the following year, we changed our methods where we maintained that same, the botanist-led methods, what we would call, and then we had a parallel study where Wabanaki people just chose locations they wanted to harvest, right? Like they would get to the salt marsh and say, where do you want to pick? And they would choose, and then we would follow them around and then make or create permanent plots in locations they chose. And it was really wonderful. We spent time, we spent time with them talking about stories, relationships, values, how they just, people opened up. I think just being respected in science, in a science project, allowed them to want to then share information in a way that was respectful. If they're going to be respected, then they can respectfully share information with you, right? And they can trust that the knowledge they share is not going to be abused. I think those are all important components. Yeah, so that part was really, really wonderful. And we created permanent plots. We measured sweetgrass stems, how much they picked, how much was there previously, and then how much grew back the following 2 years. And our results show that sweetgrass increased 30%, the stem density increased 30% in those harvester-led plots, the native-led plots, the population increased. And then the botanist-led plots in locations that Native people didn't want to pick, but picked anyways, the population didn't increase at all. You know, and there's so much value in the study, mostly because it goes past just publishing research. We've incorporated the component of reciprocity, right, to our community, where we are addressing their needs. So they've expressed concern about how to protect their harvesting rights, that this rule was given to them to how to, you know, was without really any of their information or without their feelings or thoughts of how this rule would be implemented. So one thing is to create a cultural protocol with the Indigenous cultural and Indigenous property lawyer, and to create a document that expresses what our intent is from our side, where we want our harvesting to be protected. We want ourselves to be protected. People were really concerned about how law enforcement would approach them while they're picking sweetgrass. Would they be approached under the assumption that they were doing something wrong immediately? And how would that affect their practice? Also, they didn't want to be like they didn't want to have an audience. They didn't want to be like a sideshow to just people driving by. Like how is that protected? How are they protected from the general public? And our knowledge is being protected as well. So that's a component of our research. One is to create shared publications and different shared writings for community and the outside communities, that both internal Native community and our external sort of conservation partnerships, where everybody gets to write and, you know, share of how they want to express our knowledge together. It's a collective, I think, expression. And in doing that, people have a lot of attachment to the research, which I personally love. Like I've been in groups where maybe a gatherer didn't know that I was there in the big Zoom meetings, and they'll use our Sweetgrass study as an example of research that should be taking place. They'll use the collaboration, the sort of the agency they have within the research as a way to connect more research for the future. There are people in our study who didn't feel like they were smart enough all the time, like that maybe because the education system that they're a part of always made them feel inferior. But I feel like through the study, they are taking ownership of the knowledge they have, in the sense that they are feeling that they are knowledgeable, they are smart, like that they know much more than a scientist would know. Their 50 years of knowledge is so much more vast and amazing than a scientist who's been studying it for 2 years, right? We often get told as scientists that we are the experts, that we know everything, that we're proving things. I think it's important to flip that, the power dynamics, and to show that in your work, not just in your words. We have, I think as scientists, we have a responsibility to the people we work with and to the Native people, especially if we feel that understanding Native knowledge would help the climate change adaptation. I think it's important to respect the people the knowledge comes from as well, and provide outcomes and benefits that directly address their needs. Thank you.
Suzanne, thank you so much. Such a great way of telling your story through that research project. I also use it as an example, but mostly because I say it's Suzanne Greenlaw doing something that I couldn't even imagine 10 years ago, like, you know, designing a research project based upon our values of, you know, at its core, of course, our teachings with Sweetgrass are, we take care of it, it'll take care of us. I think that's our teaching for a lot of things, that our responsibility to knowing is really important. So I think, yeah, it's just such a critical story to share, and you know, putting that value of place back in is really important. I think the goal here is to transition a bit and allow Marissa, help me out here, as our guru of technology. The goal for us is to, and we just have a real simple prompt. I'll add to it, but the goal is to put you in small groups where you can have a discussion about what was presented, and really think through this prompt, which is, why is the thing that you study important to you? It's a simple prompt, but why is it important to you? And reflecting upon the presentations here, I think, also use some of this 20 minutes if you have further questions or reflections on the presentations, because we also want to have a dialogue possible for the presenters. But for us, we wanted to send you into some small groups with a task to kind of reflect. I don't know, Casey, if you have anything else to add to this moment of reflection, and we'll have you all share back. So, it's one of those things, please, someone take some notes so you can kind of share back, and we can kind of sort of think together what we might have learned. Casey, you have anything?
Yes, thank you. So in the 20 minutes that you're reflecting, I think we've got a pretty good audience. I think we are aiming to have about 5 to 6 people per breakout room. And, in that kind of first question on, why the thing that you study or you work on is important to you, what we're trying to do here is provide an opportunity for that self-reflection, but to broaden it and to open it out. And so I'll give you a specific example from my point. Like, as I was saying in the introduction of this workshop, so I studied geography and climate. And when I was younger, like a kid, for some reason, and even to this day, it's not sure exactly what it was, but I was very fascinated with weather and temperatures. For some reason, I was very interested in, I understood there were seasons and, cold transitioning to warm, summer, and so forth. But as, I had exposure to some, television and news and such, they would give numbers to each day. Today was 85, or in January, today was 26, the high, and I started writing those down. And I just became fascinated that there were patterns and trends and things like that. And as I got into college, especially being Native student, that pull to do work that was going to help my nation, my community, as well as, other tribal nations. That was kind of a transition, because I had, I had this feeling of being a scientist and wanting to study these things. I was just very interested in it. But again, thinking about, well, having family members that work in, tribal programs and have always worked back in our community, I'm like, how do I do this? And that was certainly a challenge, let's say, in the 1990s, because climate change wasn't as big of a spotlight on it, so to speak, as say in the recent decades. So, things have occurred, and I've found kind of, I guess, some sort of niche in being a scientist, but also finding ways to make that or share that information for adaptation. And it might not look exactly how I did it before. It might not come down to actual numbers and specific things I focus on, but it broadens out into, well, why are these changes important, for tribal communities, and what kinds of things are we looking at ahead to adapt to? So kind of finding that middle ground between maybe my mind very, very focused number based to really holistic kind of, okay, well, let's look at it from these different angles kind of thing. So I just wanted to share that in an example. So going into your breakout groups here, I think maybe some of you may have are calling in, and if so, I understand. No worries. If you still want to participate in the breakout sessions, I understand you'll automatically, or Marissa will help us out with that. You'll automatically be transferred into a breakout room so you can share and discuss and listen. And then when we come back at, looking here, it's going to be about 3:15. We'll just kind of do a little round robin by group. So maybe if you have a designated person that can kind of share some key points. Again, I think if we have around 30 people, it might be a little bit of a challenge to have everyone be able to give a full elaboration. But so if you can have kind of a designated person in your group to kind of do the sharing on kind of the high points. So again, why your work, what you say is important to you, and also we'll leave it open to if you had like a change in perspective, if you had kind of like an aha moment or wow, I didn't think of it this way, but now I'm thinking about it another way. That's okay to share too. I think that's what we really want. We would love you to leave from this workshop with added perspective. So I'll stop there because I think we're at 2:55.